With 4 mythical warring factions, medieval-themed music, retro-style aesthetics, and heroes destined for magical potential, it's fair to say that developer Lavapotion has attempted to write a lengthy love letter to one particular turn-based strategy franchise from the mid to late 90s. Perhaps the most obvious difference in Songs of Conquest then is instead of referring to heroes, we're now talking about wielders of both might and indeed also magic.
Sounds like it's gonna be fun!
Now, although Heroes of Might and Magic originally came to life as a spin-off from the Might and Magic RPG series, it arguably became the primary franchise in the late 90s, developed by the now defunct New World Computing Company. The third installment, released in 1999, is to this day often referred to as the most competent in the franchise. And although since then we've seen a couple of sequels throughout the years, it is fair to say that this style of game is one from a seemingly bygone era. With Songs of Conquest, however, Lavapotion decidedly makes the argument that many of the aspects that made these types of games great back then are still very much worth basing an entire game on now. Having spent more than 50 hours with Songs of Conquest, I wholeheartedly agree. And I believe that Songs of Conquest is legitimately the best torchbearer for the Heroes of Might and Magic franchise we have ever seen to date. Songs of Conquest perfectly encapsulates what made this classic franchise so interesting and engaging in the first place, and succeeds in doing so without a slavish adherence to its classic 1999 design. That said, although Songs of Conquest firmly stands on the shoulder of one particular giant here, it did seemingly forget a few lessons that its forebears taught us about game design. Notably, Songs of Conquest currently has the early access banner attached to it, so much of what I'm about to discuss is bound to shift in the foreseeable future, but suffice to say, all in all, Songs of Conquest is a very competent title. So let's put it in the context of what has come before it, and talk about where it succeeds, and where it might just need some more time to level up. At the very least, Songs of Conquest is certain to impress on a visual basis. It is an absolutely gorgeous and tremendously charming title, with tons of beautiful little details such as small animals in the form of scorpions or scurrying rats. Songs also has a great sense of motion, with floating leaves, motes, and specks of dust. The heroes, or as I mentioned earlier, wielders as they are called in this title, are varied and have truly unique designs. There's even one with a cute little rat on his shoulder. Essentially, despite the purely pixel nature of the game, the overworld still manages a very consistent and strong sense of depth that results in this modernized yet distinctly old-school vibe. This is perhaps most notable in the various cities that you'll end up establishing in Songs of Conquest, which is certainly a strong aesthetic departure from its spiritual predecessors. Whereas former titles, most notably Heroes of Might and Magic, always focused on this gorgeous windowed city screen that gave you a real sense of progress as you upgraded individual buildings and advanced throughout the tech tree, Songs of Conquest instead removes this window entirely and quite literally puts all the pieces on the board. From a visual perspective, it generally does this quite well. Although initially the barren building plots might look a little haphazardly placed and clash with their surroundings ever so slightly, as you advance, your city turns into this alluring and vibrant central piece on the overworld. Each of the 4 different factions have a distinct look, and in all cases you can in one glance see what each city is capable of and specialized in. And this leads me to a notable, perhaps the most notable, mechanical departure compared to its ancestral Inspiration franchise that reverberates throughout the entirety of Songs of Conquest, namely specialization and commitment to build orders. But before I elaborate, let's first establish and summarize the general gameplay loop of any given Songs of Conquest match. At its core, it's really quite simple. Any match begins with access to a wielder, again these are the leaders, commanders, or heroes of this game, and usually one city. Every wielder comes equipped with a few units that are placed in stacks, and this is the main focus of the game. Everything you do at that point is generally about improving at least one army as much as possible. You do this by defeating neutral encampments to collect resources and open up new pathways on the map, and these resources, of which there are 6 in Songs of Conquest, are required in order to upgrade your base, which in turn is required to upgrade your army. Your army then continues going around the map, beating up neutral encampments for more wielder experience and more resources until you ultimately capture more cities and defeat enemy factions on the map. Every time you go into a combat encounter, you instead fight on the combat map, which is a turn-based tactics fight. Again, at its core, it's really quite simple, but there are a lot of optimal ways and essentially little puzzle moments that you constantly have to make and weigh against one another on both the overworld and the combat map in order to optimally traverse the map and defeat enemies. Now, Songs of Conquest has a lot of subtle little ways in which it innovates, or at least departs from games that have come before it. I mentioned the concepts of specialization and commitment, and there's a heavy focus on this in a number of different systems. Starting with the wielder army itself, I noted that units are placed in stacks, and this has historically been the case in many of these types of games. Notable exception here, I suppose, would be the Disciples franchise, but certainly Heroes of Might and Magic, which is the main inspiration, has always had this fundamental system. In short, any given unit of the same type stacks with any other unit of the same type, resulting in fights being about who has the biggest and strongest unit stacks. Every time you attack, damage is multiplied by your stack size, and every time a stack takes damage, a certain amount of units in that stack die, meaning that during combat your units lose combat prowess if they keep taking damage. In previous titles, these stacks were effectively limitless in size, and although there are a lot of good reasons to divide stacks, the games certainly did not make this a necessity. Songs of Conquest, however, balances from the very ground up for units having specific stack size limits. For instance, a group of Face Spirits might have a maximum stack size of 20, whereas a group of Plague Rats can go up to at least 100. In fact, Songs of Conquest cleverly introduces a research mechanic that is available to each faction, allowing them to spend valuable resources in order to upgrade specific unit stack sizes, amongst other upgrades. The first result of this change is that having to invest resources in order to upgrade specific types of units inherently adds an army specialization to the game. You may very well focus your entire build order in a particular match on making your rat stacks as big and as powerful as possible, something which that wielder with the cute rat on his shoulder no doubt appreciates. Secondly, Songs of Conquest further forces this choice by limiting the size of armies themselves. The limit of an army that any given wielder can have is dependent on their command skill, meaning if your wielder has a command skill of 7, they can bring up to 7 stacks with them at any given time. Once more forcing the player to decide between who they want to bring along, whereas in previous titles you usually were only limited by purchasing power. Again, recall that cities also had specific building plots, and much like how armies are limited in size, so too can any given city only support so many structures. Many of these structures are responsible for generating units, so whereas in the classic Heroes of Might and Magic titles cities usually ended up identical in the end, in Songs of Conquest you must make a choice in both your army composition and structure choices, as you simply cannot have it all. A worry that I initially had with the Songs of Conquest's limits is that it might decrease strategic choices that you could often make and would learn to use in Heroes of Might and Magic. For instance, a common tactic in Heroes is to divvy up your army into a couple of big stacks and leave a lot of single stacks to fill out the remaining spaces, which would massively extend your fighting power, certainly early on, as enemies would have to effectively waste attacks on these trivial one-unit stacks. Certainly, this is less immediately viable in Songs of Conquest, as a starting wielder can only have a few stacks in it in the first place. However, that is not to say it isn't useful at all. In fact, it is still a common tactic I would frequently fall back on and would massively improve my army's overall effectiveness. One additional major reason for this is the unique approach to magic in Songs of Conquest. In Songs of Conquest, casting a spell, which can only be done in combat, requires your wielder to have the appropriate mana, or essence as they call it here. There are 5 types of essence: Order, Chaos, Destruction, Creation, and Arcana. The main method of obtaining this essence is in fact through your unit stacks. A group of militia, for instance, generates 1 Order essence every time their turn starts. If you divide this one group into 2 smaller groups, you would effectively generate 2 Order essence instead from the same amount of units. So as a battle continues, you're incentivized to keep a particular unit in mind, as you might not want to lose them if they have a particular essence you need for a spell you think you'll want to cast in a few turns from now. This makes it so that army compositions effectively dictate the type of supporting spells you can cast. Again, this is an interesting layer of specialization that Songs of Conquest introduces and builds upon continuously. Of course, there are more consequences to this magic system. For instance, it usually means you can't simply throw out the heaviest spell at the start of a fight and actually have to weigh your options more consistently, which I would generally consider a welcome decision-making element. It also plays pleasingly into faction differences, as some factions are inherently more attuned to a type of essence and as such a type of magic playstyle due to their unit's essence generation. For instance, the Rana, frogmen effectively, are particularly attuned to the creation magic type. This is then further improved through research as well, which is a nice subtle faction difference. That said, there are a few downsides to this system as well. A consistent issue that I ran into is that in more trivial battles, especially in fights where the enemy has no magic and you do, you're effectively incentivized to stay back and wait for your essences to tick up while they slowly walk towards you, rather than engaging in combat immediately yourself. Of course, you also have the option of auto-resolving these trivial fights, but what often tends to happen is that auto-resolve does not take into consideration the magic-heavy playstyle, leading to more than necessary casualties, especially for magic-heavy armies. But the one thing I probably found most disappointing as a result of this magic system is that as a match goes on for a significant amount of time, your wielders gradually become better at all kinds of magic, and start gaining essences from other sources such as through research, through specific structures captured on the map, or simply by picking these essences when leveling up. The result being that 30-40 turns into a game, you'll end up with armies that gain pretty much all kinds of magic consistently. Certainly they won't gain all in equal amounts, and again there's usually a slight faction bias for magic here, but nevertheless it is an awkward situation that clashes against the specialization-focused design of this game when you effectively start having combat with all magic available to you. Not to mention, it simply gets needlessly confusing to keep track of what types of magic an enemy might be able to cast. This is especially painful as this was a classic design element that Heroes of Might and Magic did so well that Songs seemingly abandoned, with worse gameplay and character identity as a result. Namely, Heroes had the Mage Tower structures that required you to learn magic as the game went on that felt more refined than what we have now in Songs of Conquest. This Mage Tower would have to be constructed in a city, and there were a lot of positive aspects to this system. For one, faction asymmetry was further advanced through this system because every faction had different odds for different spell types. Essentially, every tier of this Mage Tower would grant you access to specific randomized spells, and a faction such as, say, the Demonic Inferno faction would have a higher chance of accessing fire spells from that particular Mage Tower pool. Aside from the spells a hero might pick up from navigating across the overworld, the vast majority of their spell options would come from visiting these Mage Towers, meaning that although Songs of Conquest has a nice little faction bias in spellcasting, this was much more strongly felt in Heroes of Might and Magic, through a more naturally synergetic system with the overworld, which resulted in heroes that were characterized by their chosen spell masteries and faction. Because available mana, or spell points as it was called there, were directly tied to a knowledge statistic that you had to invest into while leveling, it also meant that you saw a clear contrast between spellcast heavy heroes and martial heavy heroes. Secondly, as mentioned, spells could be found and picked up on the overworld. Now, I've personally always considered a game such as Heroes of Might and Magic to essentially act as a combat-focused divergence of the 4X genre. Certainly it doesn't play into this as much as a Civilization-like game does, which is the most common 4X example. After all, Heroes has more simplistic expansions, no diplomacy or anything of the sort, but it does come close in general game promise. Namely the promises of exploring, expanding, exploiting, and exterminating, especially the latter, with game franchises such as Age of Wonders or Warlock Mastery of the Arcane blurring the lines even more, as these might as well be called fantasy civilization. Whether or not you can rightfully call these turn-based strategy titles a branch of 4X is honestly besides the point though. What matters is that exploration and exploitation of the map does play into the game promises of Heroes of Might and Magic. You constantly explore, searching for resources and items, and although these aspects are absolutely prevalent in Songs of Conquest, By essentially removing this layer of spell discovery, they have effectively reduced the amount of exploring you have to do. Disciples 2 had a whole different approach entirely. Spells were purely for the overworld and relied on capturing mana on the map to cast in the first place. Songs of Conquest, sadly, does not tie this system into the overworld at all, besides picking up the occasional spires that improve your mana output ever so slightly, which is certainly never necessary, leaving it oddly disconnected from the rest of the game. In Songs of Conquest, as it stands, you generally have your spell bar flooded with magic from every single school, simply because you started leveling up, you started expanding your army, and you started capturing towers on the map, which really blurs the character identity that the game otherwise manages to establish quite well. It is a really double-edged sword, as from a purely combat map perspective, Essence slowly trickling in makes for a more interesting decision-making element, but from a macro decision standpoint, Songs has a much less involved magic system. You are never at risk of running out of mana either. I then certainly hope that in future updates, developer Lavapotion finds ways to enhance their magic system that plays more into a sense of character identity and connections with exploring and advancing the overworld, much like these mage towers and spell scrolls in Heroes of Might and Magic historically created. Speaking of areas in which Songs stumbles with character identity, let's talk more broadly about leveling up. In general, this system in Songs is serviceable, but actually let down by having everything clustered together. As you defeat neutral enemies and opposing factions, your wielder gains experience. As you would expect, this means that they level up, and every time you have a wielder level up, you're presented with 3 choices of which you can pick one option. These choices are usually based on advancing skills you already have. It's a bit more complex than this, but for simplicity's sake, this is mainly how it works. Now that would all be fine, if not for the aforementioned systems also having an effect here, and I don't think it's a positive one. For one, again, speaking of magic, you're often given essences or spell tier improvements here, which would be fine on its own, but considering how strong spell tiers are and how easy it is to gain access to every sort of spell, it tends to outweigh any other option quite quickly and homogenizes the type of wielders you end up with. More annoyingly though is the fact that army size is linked to a skill you have to learn. As I said, army size is based on the command skill. Now what this means is that it's almost always the correct choice, certainly early on, to improve your command skill at the cost of every other option, meaning you simply don't feel like it's much of a choice in the first place. Because one-size stacks can be so effective, be it as simple meat shields, be it as essence generators, for whatever particular reason, this means that simply improving the command skill so you can have another one-size stack is usually both the best short-term play and certainly the best long-term play, as you want to actually increase the size of your army. Rather annoyingly, once you have maxed out this command skill, it still pops up as a choice, or rather, it takes one away. Even for a wielder that you use for utility purposes, such as having a dedicated wielder or two for collecting map resources, it usually ends up being the superior option, as this also allows this wielder to more effectively ferry units from your base to your main army. Certainly, Songs of Conquest could do with a more engaging leveling up system and possibly tying the command skill to something else entirely, such as, say, wielder level, rather than a talent you have to pick every level up. Now, regarding ferrying, utility and map movement in general, there are a number of clever improvements that Songs of Conquest does make in this field. These types of turn-based strategy titles can certainly get more tedious as the game goes on, as you gain access to more and more armies and more cities, requiring you to manually move more and more individual units. Specifically, I always thought the Heroes of Might and Magic franchise has never been too bad in this area, especially when compared to more map management heavy 4X titles such as Civilization, but nevertheless it does occur to quite an extent. Songs of Conquest actually curtails the amount of wielders you can have at any given point. Rather than merely limiting this to your gold income, Songs has tied this limit into base building, reducing the tediousness of optimally sending as many heroes as you can at any given time to swarm across the map like a plague of locusts to collect resources as fast as possible and to create a long line of unit ferrying chains. Effectively, in Songs it becomes a more strategic decision and commitment of making sure you can tech up or get a quick second settlement for a second or third wielder rather than simply purchasing them as fast as you can. Resources in turn are divided in 6 different types. Primarily there's gold, which is effectively your purchasing power, then secondarily there's stone and wood, which is mainly used to build structures, And then there are 3 tertiary resources in the form of the Spider Silk Glimmerweave, the Orange Ancient Amber, and the Purple Celestial Ore. In general, this feels like a competent balance, as it doesn't get too complicated, nor does it limit you too much by requiring all kinds of different resources, while still offering a way to plan ahead and tailor your build order based on which tertiary resource you have early access to. There's also a number of smaller, more subtle adjustments to the flow of the game that generally remove tediousness. For instance, Songs has a specific building that pulls all unit-generating buildings together, allowing you to remotely recruit units from every city in one location. This is, of course, at the cost of effectively losing a building slot that could otherwise generate resources or more units itself, so it is a competent strategic choice added to your build options that frees you up from having to ferry units with other wielders. Furthermore, when you do defeat your opponents and manage to capture their cities, Songs also has a few different so-called siege modes. Razing is a quick way to disable a city while allowing you to keep going with your wielder, but leaves the city open to an easy recapture. Alternatively, converting a city usually takes a number of turns, offering the defender the opportunity to come back with an army and chase the aggressor out. Specifically, this makes chasing after armies and capturing cities significantly less of a whack-a-mole game as the game goes on, which is a welcome change. Alright, enough about the map, let's discuss combat. Again, much like maneuvering the overworld, managing combat is a simple exercise at its core. The attacking army starts with their units placed on the left side, while the defenders start on the right. Pleasingly, in Songs you do get the option of relocating your units ever so slightly prior to a fight, which can genuinely have a big impact on how a fight turns out. From there on out, units with the highest initiative go first, and after every unit has gone once, the round usually ends and you go again. This continues until the last stack of an enemy has died. Now of course, it's never quite that simple. Units have varying movement ranges, some have abilities, and statistics such as initiative can be manipulated mid-fight through the use of magic. Additionally, Songs has added a few slight unique elements here that its predecessors generally lacked. For one, terrain can often be elevated, and units standing on the high ground have a fitting high ground bonus in both defense and offense. For range units, this is particularly important. Secondly, practically every unit has a zone of control, which means that if an enemy unit tries to move through this zone, they will get hit by that stack for every hex that they travel in it. Both of these systems promote focusing more on holding down a specific area on the combat map and reward clever maneuvering more than classic games of this type usually ever did. There is also a general increase of pace, which is largely the result of every unit being able to both move and attack in one turn, rather than having to choose to do one action. Now, I mentioned that one-stack units are still very useful, and they certainly are, but Songs has made what may seem like a bit of an exploitative tactic, one that clearly comes with more downsides. Of course, there's the aforementioned limit in army sizes, but even on the combat map, Songs has a specific mechanic in place that rewards you for killing a full stack, regardless of stack size, called momentum. Momentum is really quite simple, but nevertheless effective. Specifically, every time your army kills a set of stacks, they gain an increasingly large momentum buff, which increases their combat effectiveness. Simple, but there's a larger concept at play here, perhaps. Namely, in Heroes of Might and Magic, battles were often best when one side was clearly dominant over the other. This is because losing units resulted in a real sense of attrition, as this meant you could no longer continue on the overworld and had to spend multiple turns replenishing your stack sizes. As a result of this, in Heroes you often wanted to play a combat encounter a little bit more passively, and with the global access to the waiting ability in Heroes, this usually meant you wanted to wait for enemies to approach you in combat rather than the other way around. The point is, you wanted to win decisively, and any combat encounter that you wouldn't win decidedly was probably one best waiting with. Momentum in Songs of Conquest plays into this mindset quite effectively, as it inherently rewards the winning side and allows you to snowball faster and more effectively, increasing the pace of the game quite consistently throughout. Now, the wait mechanic isn't entirely gone, however. Songs instead limits this ability to only a specific set of units, which isn't necessarily an issue. Certainly, the global waiting game in Heroes, resulting in waiting and sweeping an encounter, was not exactly the most exciting type of gameplay, so this now being present on only some units is a very welcome change. However, unfortunately as it stands, Songs doesn't quite nail the diversity of units, and the wait ability itself is far too commonly used on different units. In general, I would say this is one of Songs of Conquest's most lackluster areas as of right now: the lack of proper unit asymmetry. The weight ability is but one example, but this ability is present on, I would estimate, about 25% of the entire pool of units in the game currently. Furthermore, most ranged units when upgraded get the same aim or ambush ability, and when looking at specific units there's a lot of statistics that feel too similar. For instance, the horned ones from the Arlian faction are practically the same as the brutes from the Baria faction. This is certainly a step down from the classic Heroes games, especially when you consider that they often had, shall we say, more creative and strange options, such as the Ifrit, Phoenix, or certain elemental units being entirely immune to fire, which then allowed you to make an army entirely dedicated to showering the map with fire spells at no risk of your own army. None of that sadly exists to this extent in Songs of Conquest as of right now, and it's easily one of the weakest areas of the game. In fact, let's have a brief overview of each faction currently present in Songs of Conquest. As I said, there are currently 4, and as I've also noted, the faction differences are a bit of a mixed bag of good ideas such as magic bias, and disappointing areas such as the lack of ability diversity. For one, there's the Arlian faction, which focuses on concepts of order, castles, and knighthood, but also mixes this up with the unlikely allies in the form of the chaotic and magical woodland fae. They're an interesting bunch, and I particularly like the uncompromising portrayal of the main Arlian wielder in the first campaign, and mechanically they certainly have a few ways to approach the game. The second faction is called the Barony of Loth, and this is a slightly more unique take on your classic undead faction. Namely, Loth is less about hordes of undead and more about serving the former empress in both life and death, commitment to a certain oath, and re-establishing this ancient empire. Frankly, Loth is currently very powerful, with the unexpectedly unassuming strong rats proving to create an immensely powerful starting experience, while being able to gradually transition into what are almost certainly the most powerful range units in the form of the toxicologists. Third, there's the collection of swamp creatures called the Rana. The Rana have a strong natural aesthetic to them and focus heavily on beasts and shamanistic creatures. And finally we have the Baria, which is a combination of human desert tinkerers, and the Harima, which are more or less orc-like creatures. This faction then allows you to focus more on human troops, or instead on the Harima troops as the game goes on. And in fact, this is another specialization element that Songs has done quite well. Practically all of these factions have a genuinely interesting divide in troop types. For instance, I found that if I focused on the Fae creatures in the Arlian faction and spent a significant amount of time improving these units rather than the human aspects, that I created a pleasantly chaotic set of Fae armies that would focus on speed and mobility. When you then start thinking about what type of wielders would suit these armies best, and in my mind this usually comes down to what type of magic you really wanted to utilize, you can see that Songs has the real makings of specialized build orders for those of us more min-max focused. Far more so, I'd say, than games of this type historically allowed. Ultimately, I'd say Songs of Conquest has done a tremendous job at establishing a basis that is worthy of carrying the classic torch of Heroes of Might and Magic. It modernizes elements that pick up the pace and reduce tediousness from start to finish, while introducing a lot of interesting and compelling elements for really figuring out and strategizing and role-playing about what type of faction you want to end up playing as. It simply needs a little more content and a little more refinement. Currently, Songs of Conquest has 2 campaigns available and a handful of different skirmish maps, which so far genuinely play out quite differently due to their varied layouts. It also, on that note, has a map maker, which is in dire need of a UI overall, but nevertheless, given time, I'm sure this will be a good boon to the game. The campaigns themselves are serviceable. The writing available is unfortunately not particularly great, although the world building they set up is intriguing enough and makes it feel as if the factions we're presented with truly function as factions. Whereas I think a fair criticism of Heroes of Might and Magic is probably that they had the most classically stereotypical fantasy mixed bag of options available, Songs does a much better attempt at justifying why exactly each individual unit exists in this world and why they are in that particular faction, which I can greatly appreciate. Each campaign then has 4 different missions, and these can take quite a bit of time to get through, though in both cases I found them to be relatively easy. And understandably, but unfortunately, it does do the classic strategy campaign thing of limiting what you can play around with until you get to the later missions, which does mean that these campaigns are the most obvious starting point for new players, but it also means I didn't really find any challenge or found that I got a good sense of what a faction is capable of until I practically finished each individual campaign. The first campaign being for the Arleon faction and the second being for the Rana faction. I believe they've also since been nerfed in difficulty since I last played them, so it's entirely possible that they're shorter for the average person now than when I did them. Certainly there's not a ton there if you're just interested in campaign experiences, though I will say I appreciate the amount of little flavor dialogue present in both of these. Moreover, besides the desperate need for more unit diversity and increased wielder identity, the big issue I have now that slows down and prevents me from continuing at this point is that there's simply not much of a challenge present, as the game is limited to only easy and normal AI at this stage. As I said, I've now spent approximately 50 hours really sifting through everything this game has to offer, but it's fair to say that the challenge of this game was probably gone at less than 5 hours into the game. You can absolutely and entirely win a skirmish match against a normal AI within 10 to 15 turns. It varies from specific map to map, as starting positions can be significantly more difficult on some, but if you're a veteran of these types of games, you'll probably find there's no real challenge here unless you decide to play against other players, in which case the game desperately needs a simultaneous turn option. Clearly, Skirmish, as of right now, cries out for harder AI options. Nevertheless, there's a lot to enjoy and like about this game. If you're a fan of the classic franchises, I think you'll agree that there's so much potential with this title, and never before have I seen one that feels and plays as much as a real contender to carry the Heroes of Might and Magic legacy forward into the modern age, as it were. My name has been Haas, thank you for watching.